we will go through a round of introductions just to introduce ourselves. We have 3 questions in mind that we've all sort of agreed on. I've changed the order a little bit just to create a thematic sequence as follows. First, we want to identify what problem are we trying to solve so that we have a shared understanding of the problem space. So I'll ask you 2 questions relating to the problem. One is basically about organizational culture or institutional culture as it affects feedback and continuous improvement. The other is about process or approach. And then finally, I would ask, so what are the solutions? How do we solve these problems? Okay? So that's kind of the sequence today. So let's get started with introduction. We have on the panel, there's my colleague on the panel, Vicky. Vicky Wilde is here. And I'm going to be biased and start with Vicky, if that's okay.
Thank you, Louis. Colleague privilege. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Vicky Wilde, and I've been on the donor side only 4.5 years now. So before that, I was a grantee of the Gates Foundation for 7 years, so I know what that's like. And before that, I had 27 years of implementation experience, mostly with the UN agencies focused on food and agriculture. I worked on the agriculture team, which is the Gates Foundation's largest team, and I lead the women's empowerment portfolio, which means I'm used to stirring the pot at all times, and I'll talk more about that as we go.
Excellent. Thank you, Vicky. And I'm going to now go proximity, if that's all right. There's no rhyme or reason to how I do these things, but Anthony Gitau is here, and can we have a quick intro?
Well, nice to meet you, everyone. Anthony Gitau from the Children's Investment Fund Foundation. I have been with CIF for about 1.5 years now, and previous to that, I was in the pharma world, worked with Novartis and Sanofi, and a year at PSR. So I have a bit of an idea of what it is to be on the grantee side, a bit of an idea of being outside looking into the development world from the private sector, and now sitting on the donor side and seeing what we can do to solve problems.
Thank you, Anthony. We work a lot with Unicef, so it's a great partner of ours. So let me introduce Ketan Chitnis to also quickly introduce himself.
Yes, thank you, Uli. So I'm Ketan. I work with Unicef, currently posted in New York. I've been with them for about 12 years, and then more than that, even prior to that. Yesterday I was talking to Hope from USAID, and given the theme of the panel is for donors, we are kind of a special case. We have a special position because we are both, as UNICEF being a UN organization, is what you were saying, we are both a grantee and a donor. So it's a unique position that we kind of straddle in terms of the space with in this environment. So I kind of come with those perspectives on this, and I work mostly on social behavior change communication aspects for our programs, focusing on maternal and newborn child health as well as health outbreaks.
Excellent. You've met our panelists, so let's get right into it and sip from their wisdom here. So the first question, as I outlined earlier, is trying to poke at the source of the problem, but more from organizational perspective or institutional culture. So here is the question, and we'll just take each panelist and hear your point of view. The question is, how do donors currently enable or discourage fast feedback loops so development organizations have rapid visibility of what's working or what's not working? Yeah?
You want me to start?
Yes, Vicky.
All right.
You made eye contact. So
Just following the order. Well, I'll talk about the opportunity, and then I'll talk about the challenge. And right now at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we have an enormous opportunity in that we have, after all these years of work, driving towards our mission that all lives have equal value, we have come to understand that inequities for women and girls are holding back all of our goals. They're holding back our goals in health, they're holding back our goals in family planning, and they're holding back our goals in agriculture. They're holding back our goals in poverty reduction. So for the first time, as a foundation, we have developed, through Bill and Melinda, our first strategy for women's economic empowerment. And this is now a strategic priority of our grant making. And so what we have prioritized after reviewing the data from 100 countries, because of course that's what we do, we looked at how countries change. And we looked at the evidence, and we sieved and we sieved and we sieved, and we found like 13 factors that rose to the top as levers that could be pulled to help empower women and girls. You won't be surprised that some of those levers are like keep girls in secondary school, prevent early marriage, prevent early childbirth. Yes. But as we looked at the levers that rose to the top and also layered in our comparative advantage, what we have to offer, we landed in 4 places where we thought we could perhaps innovate and learn and push the field. So our 4 top priorities are women's financial inclusion, women's market inclusion, women's land rights and how that affects their economic options, and collective action, women's self-help groups and other forms of collective action for driving to empowerment outcomes. So here's this opportunity as we're putting forward this brand new strategy. So we have a lot of learning to do. The challenge here for me is where's the voice of women and girls, especially poor, rural women and girls in farming households. These are the hardest to reach, the most remote, and the most invisible in our data and evidence systems today. It is very hard to get a picture of what's happening for them. And how do we incorporate their voice and their priorities in our grant making as a donor? And so this is part of what I'm thinking about a lot these days as a donor. How do I find the grantees who have that interface on the ground and that have the skill set and capacity to listen to women and girls, to learn from them, to figure out what works? In agriculture, we basically have a history of success from a technical point of view, but we have a lot of unintended consequences too. So for example, one of our great, large, very renowned NGO partners that is very, very good at working with women and girls was working on a dairy program in South Asia and using the classic indicators and feedback loops on yield, on leaders, on cow productivity, on crop productivity. The project's looking very, very successful. But by bringing in additional voices and metrics and dynamics and loops that were not usually used, we found out that in order to meet the increased labor demands of the dairy production, girls were being pulled out of school. Girls are being pulled out of school to take over the domestic opportunities while their mothers do this work. Now, this was a program intended to empower women. And from every point of view in our agriculture team for years and years, this was successful because of who we listen to and what kind of data we use. So one of my challenges here is bringing in a different set of metrics and a different set of feedback loops so that we ensure we're listening to everyone. And one thing I'm insisting on in all our new grant making is what we call the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index. And these are 5 indicators. It's about whether women have a say in productive decisions, whether they have access or control over productive assets, whether they have decision-making over income, how their time use is, and whether they have leadership in the community or participation in community groups. And we know from empirical evidence, when you add these 5 things together, women have agency. And agency is at the heart of development and all our goals. So we are building into every grant going forward these 5 metrics, and we've been testing and verifying them in crop investments, livestock investments, and nutrition investments. We're working on this as population-based surveys. We're working on a more nimble, light version to go into the M&E systems. We're also incorporating it into our evaluation partners, and we're incorporating it into lean data as well, so that for the first time in history, and by the way, we've also influenced USAID, many of the UN agencies, DFID, a number of other donors, all are going to use these exact same metrics. So for the first time in history, you will be able to roll up across geographies and investments and see what works and doesn't work. And that is going to be a major breakthrough. By incorporating this also into lean data, we get into rapid feedback too. And the lean data is mobile phone interviews with men and women in the household. Very quickly, within 6 weeks, we have data on key questions. Usually these are use questions. The lean data is usually used with our private sector partners, and it's usually feedback to the CEO. Is he reaching the clients he wants to reach? Are the clients happy with the product? Are they using it? Are they increasing it? We've embedded these women's empowerment metrics into that too. So we also get that rapid feedback, so we don't have to wait too long to find out that maybe disempowerment's happening or something's wrong. Anyway, that's the first thing I'd like to say.
Absolutely.
The opportunity. Yeah.
Thank you, Vicky. So we've heard the perspectives from the Gates organization. We have a lot to cover, so I'm going to use my moderator rights to sort of limit us to 5 minutes here. Be crisp, right? So the question. So now I'm going to pose the same question to my Unicef friend here, colleague here, and we want to learn from you what's working, what's not working. How are donor organizations encouraging or discouraging fast feedback and continuous improvement? Your perspective.
Thanks. So just to put it in perspective, I think some of the programs that Unicef is rolling out across countries. So we have these big 5 goal areas, around health, nutrition, protection, education, clean water, sanitation, and kind of social inclusion and address inequities. And there are multiple results under all of these, so about 25 key results. And each country kind of chooses based on their analysis and the agreement with the government. But in order to achieve those results, the focus really in the change that's happened is on looking at what we call as change strategies that we really need to have in order to achieve those results. And one of the key elements of these change strategies is the focus on data and innovation, including change strategies around social behavior change communication is the house of achieving these results. So like each program has these strategies in at least driving the results in different contexts and countries. So the role of responsive kind of feedback or real-time data is what we are kind of creating that enabling environment for when we are programming in countries. We usually work on in terms of developing the country programs based on doing a situational assessment of children and then using mix or DHS data. So Unicef does the multi-indicator cluster surveys every 3 to 5 years, depending on the context. So those clearly take much longer time to get that data in. But in order to respond to the strategies on the ground, the focus now is a bit more on looking at also these more nimble tools. So real-time monitoring, for specific areas. So we have tools such as the U-Report platform, which engages young people, for instance. But we also are using the same Rapid Pro, the base platform, which is open source software, for also having mobile technologies to look into aspects within the healthcare systems, for instance, or education systems. So there's a mHealth, mHero, I think it's called in some countries. There's also looking at data in education. So these are essentially SMS-based platforms where we are using data, for instance, such as having quick data on stockouts in primary healthcare facilities, for instance, of medicines. Teacher absenteeism in schools, for instance. So while we are looking at larger data to figure out how countries are progressing in terms of achieving goals around education, for instance, but you're also looking at quality of delivery through these change strategies, and some of those are really relying more and more on rapid data collection.
Excellent. I'll stop there. Thank you, Ketan. Let's get some perspective from Anthony as well, then we'll come back with a second round of questions.
Well, I think from a SIF perspective, the advantage that maybe we have in this particular sphere is that our founder is an activist investor. And he comes from that world where he believes that you can't start something and end it just the way it was because you said you'll end it that way. That you must be able to innovate to basically achieve the objective, which is solving the problem. Now, from a donor perspective, all that money is usually put on the table to achieve a certain objective, which is to solve the problem. But at times, I think we get stuck into the rut of just creating a grant. And that is a danger. So you're doing a grant for the sake of a grant, the implementer is implementing it for the sake of the grant and not really going out to achieve what the overall objective was to solve that particular problem. Now, the way we've done it at SIF is it basically starts from there. The question we start with is what is the problem and how do we solve it, and who is the best partner to solve it with, and what is that intervention that we're required to do. And we basically, as you may know, don't normally do requests for proposals. What we do is a co-creation of the solution. And so that is where I think as donors we could help to basically come to the table with our partners and say, if this is a problem, how do we solve it? Now, once you're at that point and you're co-creating, it's an environment where it's open and all partners are able to contribute and say, this is what works, this is what doesn't work, and also creates room for, let's try this, and if it doesn't work in a year, we could fix it, or in 6 months, we could fix it. The second thing we do is that we have, painfully sometimes for some partners, very regular monthly calls. So for every program that we have, you have a monthly call, and what that helps is that you're regularly getting, that is not based on any EME data or anything like that, it's just what is the feedback coming back, how is it going, what are you getting on the ground, are you getting obstacles, and so on. And that could essentially be the first step where you're able to change something based on something that's coming back on the ground. And then there's the more formal quarterly reviews where you have a process behind an annual review process. And for most of our grants at SIF, at the annual program review, the grantees will come back with feedback, we'll interrogate it, and at that point, we actually can amend contracts and adjust it to be able to adapt to what is going on the ground. So, and this is sort of what we do to try and allow for the iteration that would then make sure that we are remaining on track to basically solve the problem and not just deliver on the grant. And in that, I'll just give two examples. We have a program, for example, called In the Hands in Kenya, which is a program that seeks to put the power and the control of reproductive health in the girls' hands. And one of the things we did see in the first year, it wasn't even the first year, the first 6 months, we realized that the program needed some incentives for it to even become more impactful or productive. And at the 6-month point, we already worked with the partners, and to their credit, they really came around the table and said, yes, we believe this will work, and redesigned the program to kind of add on these incentives that were going to make the program more impactful. At the annual program review, we realized that the peer-to-peer recommendation of girls recruiting each other onto the platform was actually more impactful than some of the above the line communication that we had planned. And we then in the second year have put that as a priority for how we're going to engage. And I think from a donor perspective, our mandate is really to create that space so that not only our grantees, but even the beneficiaries can find a way to feedback what would work best for this kind of thing. In my previous life as a grantee, one of the things that I had learned is the rigid 5-year deliverable. You have to do this within plus or minus something of the budget, and you can't move one item across the line to the other, and it gets very frustrating because grantees are really, really the people on the ground. They know what is going on. They know exactly what they need to do, and you're basically putting them in a straitjacket that doesn't allow them to then really adapt to what is going on the ground, and that is really something that we as donors need to do to change the system.
That's fantastic. We seem to have consensus among the panelists here. And I was trying to poke at, is the source of the problem institutional or organizational? And they all have expressed that from their organizations, there seem to be this mandate, willingness to embrace fast feedback, continuous improvement. So that's great. Let's try another tact. Right? So the second tact, and this is a second question, is as follows. So learning organizations, right, always embrace experimentation. The hallmark of learning is to rapidly iterate and experiment. So here is the second question. How do donors currently create incentives or disincentives for continuous iteration, rapid prototyping, and or experimentation? I'm going to start again. No, I'm going to do the reverse order now. I'm going to go Unicef and Ketan, if you don't mind. Do you want me to repeat the question?
No, I think I got it. So how do we create incentives or disincentives for continuous iteration? It's a pretty tough question to answer, honestly. Because the focus is on results, I mean that's the key. But it's also in the context of 5-year cycles that we work on, in the development settings, and I'm gonna probably use the liberty to speak a little bit more about the responses in humanitarian situations, because I think that's where the cycles are a bit smaller or a shorter duration, at least for short duration emergencies, not the protracted ones. And I think that in those areas we are actually able to create incentives to seek feedback. So because there are commitments that we have signed up on around, for instance, accountability towards affected population, so that you're listening to the people that are affected by a particular emergency. And those listening mechanisms need to be relatively real time, as well as on a very frequent basis, so almost daily or a weekly basis, particularly within the first say 30 days of the emergency. So if it's an earthquake, for instance, or floods, you're essentially responding rapidly, and all the systems are put in place to respond rapidly, and that's where we can actually also have then the ability to have incentives for partners to collect and get feedback from communities and use that for the response. So I think in those situations, I think we have the right incentives in place. But for the more traditional programs that we do, I think while the focus is on results, there are also, because we work within certain kind of constraints, the organizational kind of constraints and the constraints of cooperating with the governments in terms of how we program, I would say that those are not maybe the most conducive situations in terms of being able to fail, for instance, for a program and coming back, changing, because the country program is approved by the board, it's signed with the government, multiple UN agencies signing onto it, other partners. It's a bit difficult to go back and make those changes, and something similar to what was said earlier. So I think in those situations, I think continuous improvement is welcome, but within the agreed upon framework, I would say. I'll stop there.
We finally got somewhere. And I'm going to ask my colleague from the Gates Foundation exactly the same question, right? Learning organizations are supposed to experiment. And the Gates organization prides itself as being an impatient optimist. So I'm asking you, Vicky, the same question. How do donors, let me not make this particular now so I don't get in trouble. How do donors currently create incentives or disincentives for continuous improvement, rapid prototyping, and or experimentation?
And before I speak about how we can do that with our grantees, let's be honest. Here as a culture, we do have a culture of continuous learning, and it's exhausting. We never are satisfied. And I love this on the one hand because it reflects a humility that we never think we've got this figured out, right? No matter how many years we're working on it, we're still humble enough to say, you know what, we really need to keep, drilling down and working on this more. But it is exhausting, and I think it's exhausting for our grantees too, to a certain extent where you're always iterating and refining. But it's necessary. And I think the way we create incentives is to build it into our grant-making structure just from day one. With our grantees, we ensure that built into the grant is a theory of change. And as we go forward, we're going to be together testing this theory of change. Very often we run into capacity gaps to do that well. And so we need to be open to and proactive, bring in the partnerships, bring in the experts to help where those gaps may be, and or budget within personnel to have capacity building as part of it too. And I think, a 15%, pad your personnel budgets by 15%. Just so you can constantly be sending people to sharpen up a little bit, right? This is important because otherwise you're coming back and the next time you're back to zero. And do that. We do have the year-to-year milestones and overall learning agenda set out, but we too have the monthly calls. I find them invaluable, even though I'm on the phone at 5 or 6 in the morning. It's invaluable. So I know last week that the women farmers I'm working with in Bihar, India, just lost their mango crop to hail. Hail as big as softballs. So I know that our team in Burundi has been stranded for weeks because of a fuel shortage. It helps us be realistic about what to expect by the end of the year in the milestones, right? That grounding. Always the field visits. But here, I think part of the incentivizing that's really important is where's this information go and how's it going to be used? Is it just to please us as the donor? I would say that's the least of it. Our goal really is that this information feeds into a policy advice to the governments and to the private sector partners. Those are the folks who are going to make this work go to scale. So part of incentivizing all this work and iteration, rapid learning, and so on is its impact in influencing governments and private sector partners. But what excites me most is when this information is back to the communities. The folks you extracted this information from, how often does that data get back? How often does it go back to the community? How often do you sit down and ground truth, that survey result, and say, here's what we heard, here's what we've understood, here's what we've written up and published. How does it resonate with you? And I have some grantees who have been absolutely brilliant at doing that. And I think this is something I'm going to be pushing for more and more, because this way, all of this rapid learning, iteration and stuff becomes empowering when it goes back to the community rather than extractive for our purposes. So I think that's very incentivizing.
Thank you, Vicky. We also would like your perspective, Anthony, and then we'll come to the final round of questions.
I think the reality of it is that it's a financial relationship, right? Between the donor and the grantee, and that's the one thing we should never ignore. And everyone sitting, I mean, I've sat as a grantee, every time the donor walked in, your aim is to make sure that the meeting ends positively and that you remain with the grant or even a larger grant after that, right? And I think that is the danger, that if we ignore that particular piece, then we're really not being realistic. And the incentives really are built into that if a grantee can then come back to me and say in 6 months, you know what, the theory of change we're working on really wasn't working, or the hypothesis we had was wrong, because we've gone to the ground, we found A, B, C, D, and basically that suggests that we should change and do this thing this way. So their reaction from the donor basically answers your question. Do I punish that honesty by closing that grant and basically saying that's a horrible grantee, they don't know how to do what they're doing? Or do I then sit with the grantee and say, look, this is great, you've come back to us in time, foresee if we believe in the word fail fast. We want to really fail fast, but it doesn't mean fail fast and stop it. What is the learning? That's the most important thing. And as Vicky is saying, how do we feed it back, not only to ourselves or to our grantees, but to the whole ecosystem, so that somebody else doesn't spend money doing what we've already failed at. It really, that's the one thing that is really important. So to the disincentive is really if you then are punished for coming back with that feedback that shows that the initial idea was not working, and you're not given an incentive to say, okay, can we sit down and co-create what the solution is, or what is the new intervention there, or is the problem solved and we don't need to do this again, and what else can we do together? So if donors are able to create that environment where a grantee is in a safe space to be able to say that without fearing loss of resources, I think there will be a much better environment where we're going to get this. On the other side of the incentives is, a good example in SAFE is organizations like Living Goods or BRAC, who have consistently, over the years, sort of fast delivered on what they agreed. They've always given feedback and modified what they're doing. They've layered on what we are constantly asking them to layer on, and still given feedback on what is working, what is not, and iterated the system to be able to continue to deliver and solve the problem. They have continuously had longer engagements and larger grants that we are working with them on. So I think it's really how do we manage that relationship to ensure that it's open, it's honest, and it's safe, that then you're not punished for, I would say, good behavior.
This is great. I think we've got to the crux of the matter here, right? So what our panelists have outlined here, I just want to call out two, is this tension between the outcomes that we expect and the time that we expect those outcomes to happen. And in between, this discussion around feedback and continuous improvement is stuck in the middle and is caught in a prism. And the question is, what happens now? Anthony just talked about the possibility of a donor reacting negatively, right? And that can have an impact on iteration or the ability to apply feedback, because that impacts the overall outcome. So we understand the problem now. Hopefully, at least I do. I hope it's clear. So now we're going to ask the final question. And this is why we started by first understanding what problem are we trying to solve. Now I'm going to ask the panelists, how do we solve this problem? And I've outlined two. So let me ask you directly. How can donors create an enabling environment for faster feedback, rapid prototyping, and continuous improvement? Now going in reverse order. I'll start with Anthony.
I think I should have started the other one first. I think the first thing for the donor is really to be open right from the beginning on what it is that you're expecting and how it's going to work. And if we want this to work, it needs to be built into the initial design of whatever it is that we're working on. It needs to be, the room has to be created within the grant mechanism and within the contracting. Because that, I think, at the end of the day, will give the grantee that sort of cover that, yes, this is really true, but if I'm just the program manager telling you, yeah, just come back and tell me if it doesn't work and we'll see how we work around it, I think it will leave everyone very uncomfortable. So I think if we start from that point where we actually create that, as we co-create, we build in this mechanism deliberately into either the granting mechanism or the contracting of this and so on, and allow for this continuous feedback to then be part of that, I think would be great. The second is, we need to, after this, I think, or from different organizations as we go out, and maybe the toolkit that the CARV initiative develops will be critical here, is we need to create that framework of how does this work, right? How do we actually, for different programs, there are short programs, there are 5-year programs, and from the previous presentations we've seen that you can actually have feedback loops within feedback loops. How do we actually create this framework that then a grant that I'm designing is able to take this into it and then run with it, so that as we build it right from the beginning, we're deliberately telling everyone who's in this that we are constantly going to be looking at how do we improve this going forward to solve our problem. So that, I believe, is how donors can manage to help this, make this work.
Thank you, Anthony. Vicky?
Yeah, I agree with everything Anthony says. I would add just 3 things. I think first, it starts with trust. You've got to build the relationship, right? And it's a relationship between the donor and the grantee, but it's also building that relationship with the broader set of players in the ecosystem, because it's not just donor-grantee that needs to be enabled. You've got to unlock other barriers around in the ecosystem. So by building that trust also with the government agency or the other partners, or with the private sector partners, it's leaning in, taking the time, build those relationships, and share some goals and learning, share the information, and so on. And this is a lot of that invisible work, that invisible glue, but it does help make things happen. It does help change happen, I think. The second is just to allow elbow room for experimentation. This is something we sometimes do well at the Gates Foundation, and sometimes not. Sometimes within an individual grant there may be limitations, but we also host things called grand challenges and grand challenge experiments, where we literally put money on the table and we invite, please send us your craziest ideas. You know, come and innovate with us on how to do this. And we've seen some fantastic, innovative, groundbreaking ideas come through. A lot of them technology-driven innovations to kind of leap over current barriers. And I think this is one thing we at the foundation can do pretty well.
Thank you, Vicky.
Last word. I think the way we are able to create the enabling environment is really, you know, the focus is on the problem one is trying to solve, and realizing that some of the problems that we're trying to solve are really complex, and some of them are sometimes, you know, potentially of relatively less complexity. So, you know, for the example being, for instance, we're looking at vaccine hesitancy in certain countries. We're using human-centered design approach to try and go in and understand those problems. Those help us to kind of you know, be able to problem solve in a relatively short period of time, and be able to see results relatively quickly, because immunization data comes in, you know, on a weekly basis or a monthly basis. So it's easier to create, you know, that environment of responsiveness, flexibility, and if it's not working, you know, we can drop that and move to something else. You know, so that's something that I've seen in Unicef happen. But when the problems are more complex, right? When we're trying to address issues around, you know, violence against children, or, you know, child marriage and things like that, I think the programs by design, which are done in collaboration with other agencies, with governments, have a very complex theory of change, and to that's where I think it becomes a bit of a challenge in terms of having. I don't think we've been able to actually incorporate these rapid feedback mechanisms in some of those large programs, which are trying to address pretty complex issues. Which, of course, there's evidence that norms can change quickly, so we're kind of looking at some of that literature, trying to use that in programs. But I think there isn't a recipe, like there is for vaccines, for instance, for solving some of these I would call them complex problems. And that's where it becomes, also the environment is a bit rigid in those situations, at least the way we program right now for creating an environment for continuous improvement. I'll stop there.
Just brilliant, all three of you. So let me distill, a lot's been said, let me distill it into three categories. And I think it's a mandate for each of us. And I picked three because I just want to isolate three categories here of folks. First, to the grantee, and I think that's where Ketan ended, right? That there should be a dose of realism on your part, right? Try to understand the nature and complexity of the problem you're trying to solve and the nuance of the theory of change implied in it. Just be realistic. So that's one. To the donors, us, be clear from the outset. Clarity, 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 clarity from the outset. And then finally, to the third category is the curve. All of us, the community of practice, there is something for us. And it says that we need to spend time now working together to create a framework for implementing best practices around fast feedback, continuous improvement. Because it's not a given. We need that framework. Based on that, I'm going to open it up to questions. I've learned a lot. I'm going to open it up to questions. We have about 10 minutes. We're standing between you and lunch. There's a moderator. Now I yield to her.
Hi there. I was really struck by the case study you shared, Vicky, around the unintended consequences. And I think one of the things we've found when we talk about the curve to people for the first time is they assume that it's about getting or finding out how you're performing against outputs and outcomes faster and normally cheaper. And that's one way that responsive feedback could be used. But it struck me that you could employ a faster way to find out how you perform against outcomes and outputs, but you never would have found out your learning and unintended consequences. And my question on behalf of the Curve Initiative is, should we be thinking in this initiative more about how we get feedback on outcomes or outputs faster, or should we be looking at how can responsive feedback provide alternative viewpoints and help us maybe find things that we might not pick up otherwise? So I'd be really interested to hear your perspective.
Wouldn't it be nice to do both? I find one of the biggest risks in our work is, our drive with rigor and evidence is that we end up looking for the keys under the lamppost. You know that story where the guy has dropped his keys and he's searching for them under the lamppost, not because that's where he dropped them, but just because that's where there's light and he can see. And sometimes I figure, we're so focused on where rigor and pre-existing evidence leads us, that's where we're focused, and we might miss what's actually happening outside of that. And this is the risk, and why I think it's so important, the bringing in multiple voices and feeding the information back for ground truthing. Very important for bringing out unintended consequences sometimes, because there's lots of them.
Thank you, Vicky. See a question at the back, and then Priya, and then I just met you. And then you.
So I'll make two assertions. One is that a grantee, to get the grant, maybe optimistic about what's going to occur. So that's one assertion, which everyone's nodding at. The other is that we work in very difficult contexts and environments, and things happen. Mango crops get wiped out. I was just saying that, just reflecting that actually I had a proposal which I funded, and I said, well, actually, I don't think these are realistic targets. And I negotiated the targets down for the same price. And not a grantee contractor, I'm going to call it that, contractors, they were amazed that we were going to do that. I was wondering whether the panel do that. Do you do that? Because that allows wiggle room, it allows for risk-taking and improvement and failing. Because if you're tied to a very difficult target, that doesn't allow for that.
Ketan, Anthony?
So maybe just from the CIF perspective, because we have to present the grant to our program investment committee, you basically have to abort the targets yourself because you're the one held accountable. The grantee is not really in the room to take the heat for that. So in the co-creation environment, it allows for that ability to challenge. So it's not that I asked you how you will reduce teen pregnancy and you gave me this crazy target. It's that we work together and say, if we are to achieve that, this is what we're going to do. So I guess in a sense that happens, but the reality is also in our regular program reviews, we then go back and question the assumptions that we have, because even as we did it, a lot of it is based on either existing data or hypothesis. So we might also have overstated the targets, and we have had several programs where we've had to change that, either higher based on the reality or lower based on the reality without financial impact on the grant. But I agree with you, it's really important to be realistic.
If you do it straight away, then it gives the grantee that freedom to do things.
And confidence that you're actually not looking to punish them.
Excellent. We'll take 2 more questions and then we'll break for lunch. Okay? Actually, both of you. I mean, we'll just stay on that table. If that's okay.
He's stealing the mic. Hi, thank you so much for that. That was super interesting. I was just wondering, one of the points that came up right at the end was this tension. Complexity is really on a scale, right? Simple to complex. And that tension between rapid experimentation and a human-centered design approach and a traditional public health approach that's very risk-averse, and that is coming up a lot for us. And I just wondered whether you started developing processes or rules of thumb or boundaries or processes for integrating those 2 imperatives within this kind of work.
Just quick reaction. I think we're being open to looking at all these tools that we have, which are particularly to break down the complex problems into smaller problems, and then trying to solve those small problems. I think that's one thing that we are really encouraging and doing it in areas. So I mean, some of the nudge approaches are that, right? If somebody is about at the cusp of change from intention to action, then kind of identifying which results we can focus on where we could apply some of those tools. So we're kind of looking into addressing those issues with kind of basket of tools that exist to go beyond the very traditional problem solving approach.
One final question, this gentleman here, and then as a lady on the other side. Okay.
When the panelists talked about creating enabling environment for experimentation, what is your take as the donor on ensuring sustainability of these experiments, especially for behavior change, as we know that the behavior change takes time?
I'll give one example. One of the things we do sometimes is use our grant making to buy down some risk, to try something that we know might not work. And so especially, for example, when we're partnering with the private sector. And let's say we want to make sure that this company in northern Nigeria is going to benefit, of the 1 million people it's going to reach, that 75% of them are going to be women. And they have never thought about it, and so on. So we will use our grant making and our guidance and shaping to help buy down that risk and experiment and test and figure this out. And things will work and things won't work, but we start with 5 things and we end up narrowing down to 2 over the course of time, and then they're on, because they're private sector, they're on to scaling. That's one way we're approaching it.
And just to add to that, it's also the advantage that you have sometimes with the private philanthropies is that you're able to take on the more risky stuff, the things that are not proven. You want to be able to really pilot things that if you went to the government, for example, they'll just tell you there's no proof. So that's the advantage that we have probably in that we can do that. But the real sustainability of it would be is how do we walk that path with all the other stakeholders, the large bilaterals or government, to ensure that then if this great innovation or idea then works out, that it's something that they can put in mainstream into the normal system and then sustain through public sector funding or government engagement in it. So that's potentially how we kind of able to lead to the sustainability.
One more question.
Thank you. So I just want to thank all the panelists for kind of giving us a better idea of the negotiations between this tension of accountability and learning. And I mean, I like what one of the participants said, that continuous improvement happens, but there's a spectrum and there's a balance and a financial relationship to respect. So I think that's been helpful for me, at least, appreciating the struggle or challenge that donors face. And I wanted to kind of bring up again something that Vicky had mentioned, and then also Anthony. Vicky had mentioned a learning agenda, and Anthony had mentioned a framework. And I deal with PMPs on almost a daily basis, and I'm constantly looking at these numbers and targets, and I'm asking myself, what does that learning agenda look like, and what are ways, or if there are ways, or what are the ways that donors have thought about measuring not just are you meeting the results, but how are you systematically, what is the framework or the rubric we're looking at? Are you learning as you're achieving? And is there kind of, what's the internal thought about that and structuring it so that it's not, yes, it's enabling culture and it's a cultural value that you've obviously all three expressed, but how do you actually evaluate that more systematically?
I'll take a stab at that because I'm thinking a lot about learning agendas, and I hope we're getting better at it as we go. But within any one grant, there are certain things you're solving for. And then you also, with your theory of change, you also have to say, and here are the things we're not sure about. So for example, in my work, we really want to increase women's incomes, right? You can measure that. How do you know if you're increasing her decision making or how that income gets used? That's a much harder issue. And so how do you put a learning agenda around that? And what makes sense? So then you start looking at multiple approaches. And so you identify those, what you're pretty sure you can solve for, report on, and put milestones against. And then it's also laying out, here are those crucial questions we really don't know which way it's going to go. And being honest about it, laying them out, and then trying to put some learning agenda, some mechanisms to solve for those. And I think that is the exciting work. And that starts filling in gaps in our knowledge too.
I think, to be honest, I don't think we have a deliberate way to measure what we got out of learning. I think we just have that commitment that everything that we do, first of all, is open source. It needs to feed back into the ecosystem. But I think I'll defer to my evidence colleague to say that I don't think we have, I can remember anyway, we're deliberately measuring to say this is what we've gotten out of it. But it's a good challenge that I think we need to be able to take up, to look at just how much learning each program is bringing and how it's feeding back into the whole ecosystem.
Quickly, I said to my colleagues in the ICU, Priya is here, MLE, the L can be augmented and supported by a lot of the work we do in AI, artificial intelligence. And I'm going to talk about it at 2 o'clock today. But one final question and then we can wrap up.
Yes, you, Priya.
Yes, Priya.
No, I think it wasn't really a question, but thank you. There's a lot that you got all shared. I think a lot to absorb. But I was just thinking, as you were talking, that how much do we really buy the agenda of continuous improvement, and how much do we push our partners to that? I think there's a balance that we need to strike, because what I've been learning since yesterday, and it's been really useful, is even today you said rapid is not rapid actually, lean is not really lean. We're using a lot of terminology and we're kind of packaging it, assuming that it's working in exactly the way it's conceptualized, but it isn't. And where is going to be our moments of reflection? What are we doing to the field? Where is our caution and caveats? And I would love that reflection at some point, maybe 6 months from now, Suhail. We need to have that a year from now to say, okay, we have all these investments. What have we learned in terms of the failures of CI or rapid feedback? And I'm not saying that because I hope that's not, but I think there will be positives and negatives, and then we also have to check ourselves to say, where is it really critical? What really hinges? Whose decision? What data? For what purpose? And to get that level of granularity, of course, when you're just innovating and testing in like a phase 1, I understand that you could nest a lot of interventions because you're harnessing. But at some point, I think Alok's question of sustainability is coming from, they're on season 3, and have we now created some kind of contingency that there will be a donor dependency? But you're right. Honestly, the government should be picking this up. The donors can't continue to do this. So to me, there are lots of questions here that, where is the pause, where is the reflection, and what decisions do we make from that?
Actually, I would say that that's a good way to end. I mean it seriously. As moderator, I was thinking of what is the best way to wrap it up. But you're absolutely right. This panel has challenged us and drawn us into moments of reflection, right? And there are 3 parties here, and I mentioned it earlier. So there is a donor, right? And there's a grantee. But there is this community of practice, and we all have work to do. So let's reflect on that. With that, thank you, and let's appreciate this panel.